Yeah, you know, it's interesting. A lot of things happen when you grow quickly. A lot of things start to occur to you, and one of them is you tend to lose touch with people. You lose a little bit of that community feeling, you know, that you had, like when my wife and I came in '96, and it was Brentwood Baptist was roughly the size, a little bit larger than what Station Hill is now, you know, and so it was easy to meet people, it was easy to make friends. But as you grow, it's harder to maintain that level of community. Another thing that happens, though, is you have more people from surrounding areas that are coming. Or the people who are coming are moving out to surrounding areas. And that's what happened with a lot of us who ended up on the launch team at Station Hill. We were coming to Brentwood Baptist and had been for a long time. But we were driving all the way in from Spring Hill. And so you ended up with this contingent of young families who would meet people in the grocery store and start conversations, have gospel conversations. And we would invite our friends to church. And they would go, "Great, where?" And we would say, "Well, it's in Brentwood." And what we found was not only was that a geographic barrier, but oftentimes it was other kinds of barriers too, socioeconomic or whatever. And different people thought different things. And so we said, what would it look like if we had an expression of Brentwood Baptist in our local community? And we, at the time, were in our building plan where we were about as large as we knew we were going to be. The wise folks that made those long-term plans for us had kind of said, you know, at some point we've got to consider, like, maybe we don't need to be bigger as a facility. That doesn't mean that we need to let that limit the growth of God's church. And so how do you do that? There was a movement among evangelical churches at that time, and had been for a few years. Churches, large ones, mega churches, were experiencing or were experimenting rather with different campuses. What would it look like? Is it a kind of a church in the box? Is it an exact replication of what you have at the big church, the mother church, however you want to say it? And so the church put a team of folks together. They visited a few of these churches. And my wife and I sat on a team where we kind of just looked at that and said, what would this look like? That was a 2 or 3 year long process. The reality is then we were feeling what Mike would later express as the militancy initiative, this idea that every local community should have a healthy, thriving church where people can go, a group of believers who can respond to local community needs. And those needs, whether they're healthcare, poverty, education, are always best met and historically best met through the context of the church. And so how can we do that? The recognition that, you know, in any given day there are about 200 churches in Middle Tennessee that if something doesn't change in the next 200 years, they're probably going to go away. You know, how can we reverse that trend? How can we keep a parking lot or shopping center from going where that church used to be? And so Station Hill was really the first expression of that. We actually contacted a few of the local churches that did exist in the Thompson Station and Spring Hill area, let them know about our plans, and they said 2 words: hurry up. They recognized the need for more believers, for a greater strategic effort to care for the community of Spring Hill and Thompson Station through the context of the church. And so it became a no-brainer, you know, starting Station Hill. And obviously God was in that. Not only has Station Hill grown, but the number of campuses, not all new works, some of them regional campuses from existing churches, of course, as well. But just a really unique and wonderful thing we've watched him do that started with the church at Station Hill. You know, one of the things that we were batting around with our friends when we were talking about Station Hill was leaving Brentwood, this idea of, you know, all of us were involved in the choir or the orchestra. Our children were all, you know, we didn't have Marketplace back then, but I mean, even the children's programming was excellent. And we just sensed that we would be leaving all of that behind and going to a school or a gym, or who knew at that time what, you know, where we would be going. And so there was a little bit of that. There was a little bit of trepidation. You know, would we sense a loss there? In reality, it was the opposite. It was a fire. It was exciting. We would hear stories of the people who started Brentwood Baptist. They would talk about the fellowship of the chairs, you know, how they would all meet, put out the chairs, have church, and then pull the chairs up so they could roller skate, you know. We never bought roller skates, but we were certainly the fellowship of the chairs because we loved it. When it came time to have a fellowship, we would all put out the tables, you know. And even now at Station Hill, we have an incredible facility staff, but a lot of times we argue with them because we want to do some of what they're doing, you know, and they let us. They understand that, you know. The other night we had a family gathering and we were all putting up tables and that kind of thing because shared experiences, that's how you bond, you know, and even if it's something as simple as that. And so we didn't miss anything. We didn't miss anything at all. The one thing that kept us going was so many of us had gone in 2007 to Thailand, to Chiang Mai, and we helped lead a conference there. And we basically took Brentwood Baptist's worship and teaching and VBS and implanted it there at a hotel in Chiang Mai, Thailand. So we knew we could replicate what we did in crazy circumstances with little resources. So we weren't as worried about that. And that turned out to be almost to the T, a large number of people who were on that Thailand trip who were singing and playing and leading were people who ended up on the launch team at Station Hill. It was totally God's provision, and it was His hand working through all of it. It was pretty cool. Yeah, it all moved really quickly. It didn't feel that way at the time, but you know, in hindsight. 2007, we go to Chiang Mai, Thailand. We experience what it's like to pick Brentwood Baptist up and move it somewhere. We come back in the midst of feeling the post-trip depression. If you've ever been on a mission trip, you know what I'm talking about. And you get home after all that camaraderie, especially when there's 100 of you, and that's how many we took. And we're all kind of sitting around calling each other, emailing each other like, man, I miss everybody. I miss being over there, you know. Even at the time we were like, I just want a cheeseburger, you know. But right about that time was when we started the campus conversation. And so many of us, it was just a natural progression. You know, it was almost like a north winding, like God was preparing us for the desire, you know, to do that. We immediately started that. Another interesting thing was happening at that time is we had a Sunday night service at Brentwood Baptist. We've always experimented from time to time in a healthy way with different worship offerings. We've done Friday nights before, and at the time we had a Sunday night worship offering, and it was meant to be a more relaxed, casual atmosphere, a lot like 11:11, you know, ended up being on Sunday morning. About the time we got ready to form the launch team for Station Hill, Brentwood Baptist came to us and said, "What if we give you guys the Sunday night service?" Like, Jay, it was already tapped to be the campus and teaching pastor for Station Hill. Jay, you preach. Talk to the worship team. Why don't you guys lead? And then everyone can come. Now, more people than were on the launch team came on Sunday nights, but it really was an incredible testing ground for us. And so we spent, I don't know how long it was, several months. We spent, we would come, we would get ready to lead, we would have church together, and when it was over, we all gathered in the Connection Cafe, which was relatively new at the time. And again, God's providence. And we would all buy our dinner or bring our dinner or whatever, and all the families would eat dinner after church in the Connection Center after having a worship service that was almost exclusively what became the church at Station Hill. We did that for a while. I don't know what it was at 2010, somewhere around in there. I think maybe February. I think if I've got my dates right. If not, cut this. But 2010, we launched in the lunchroom of Heritage Middle School. And then it became not the fellowship of the chairs, but the fellowship of the lunchroom chairs, which are decidedly more difficult to navigate, by the way. A lot of pinched fingers and yelps were going on at that time. We only stayed there a few months, though. We had already identified a lease space right behind Kroger Marketplace. It was a build-out right next to a preschool. We were able to use the preschool facilities and have our worship services in the build-out. So right around Easter of that year, we moved in, and it was a glorious time. You know, it was funny because all the worrying we were doing about relative deprivation, like we're going to do without this great service and this great programming, you know, God said, well, I tell you what, why don't I let you be in a lunchroom for a few months, and then you'll see how great having a place of your own is. And so we did. We were there for a number of years. It presented its own challenges, but it was a blessing for sure. But eventually we had just outgrown the space. God was bringing people to us. The Lord was blessing the efforts at the church at Station Hill, and so we knew we had to start looking for land. And so we eventually, Brentwood Baptist approved the purchase of land and not long after that broke ground on a rainy Sunday afternoon, I believe it was. We all tromped through the mud and stuck our shovels into the ground. I still have pictures that float up on my TV every once in a while of that. And even now, as we're near the end of completion on what we're calling Phase 2A, which is essentially an educational space to supplement what we already have in our new facility, I'm looking at some of the construction remnants of that laying around, and I'm thinking back to breaking ground on that thing, and I'm just going, wow. I mean, look what God has done. We don't put a great emphasis on buildings and numbers. You know, the church is the people, and every time church is over and those people go home, the church has left the building. They go out into the community. But then they gather again, and this gathering of the saints that the Bible tells us not to forsake, that is the lifeblood of who we are from week to week. We experience that together in a well-equipped facility where we can hear what is said. We can see what we need to see. We can greet people appropriately as they come in, people who may be hostile to the idea of church or who have just never heard Jesus put in a healthy way, in a correct way. And so we praise the Lord for that facility because inasmuch as, yes, it's great to see the growth and it's great to see the big buildings and all those kinds of things, what we know that represents is a building of the kingdom. We know it represents more people coming, hearing, learning, growing, and going. And that's what it's all about. Back when we were starting Station Hill, I was actually on staff at Brentwood Baptist Church, but as a marketing director. I had not yet surrendered to the ministry. I was not on staff at Station Hill. I was friends with Jay and obviously worked with him in the context of my own job. And Mike, you know, I knew Mike as well and worked with him on a daily basis. So I probably can't speak too much to that dynamic necessarily, other than it's neat to watch Jay. I came on staff about the same time Jay did. Again, I came on in the communications department, and he came on at the time as a middle school minister. He's, I think, we're within a year of one another age-wise. And so it's been really interesting to watch him grow in his role and different roles. You know, as he was here from year to year, take on more and more leadership and grow, watch him preach from time to time. I remember when we did the, what was that sermon series? Some of the story. I remember when we did a sermon series that was all about gospel conversations, essentially. And Jay was the one who preached the whole series. Of course, this was at Brentwood Baptist Church. One of the first times many of us had heard him preach for any extended period of time, you know, other than the one-offs here and there. And many of us looked around, and it was obvious. You know, we were like, wow, you know, look what God is doing. It's really cool. So what a blessing it is to work just down the hall from him now. Still sit under his preaching, still get to learn from him, still get to talk with him on a daily basis, but in a completely different context. So God was preparing him way back then to do that. I don't know at what point that decision was made. You know, Jay tells a story as a part of our Discover classes often, how at some point Mike did come to him and maybe ask him this. At some point Mike did come to him and say, man, you know, tear up your resume. We want to keep you here. We don't know what it looks like for the future. We just know God brought you here for something. And then advance a few years and the something presents itself. So when we were building Station Hill, I was actually on the communications team, not the ministerial team. So I was very involved in the process. And I remember we created a document that was meant to be a template moving forward, right? So all the different things we would need to think about, when we would need which minister when, and what carts to buy, and what ministries to start, and all of that. And so we knew already we would probably have another campus somewhere down the line, somewhere. We just didn't know what it would look like. But we knew this document, right, was going to tell us what we needed to do. And boy, were we wrong, right? What we learned immediately was that every expression of a campus, whether it was a new work or whether it was you know, a merger with an existing church, looked extremely different. And the things that we thought would be universal really became more contextual. Now, obviously, we learned a lot from each and every experience, okay? Whether it be about real estate or whether it be about ministry staff or the best way to communicate or whatever. But the reality is, every part of town is different. That was the whole point to creating campuses, was to allow the local church to live and breathe and look like the local church. So Station Hill looks a lot different than the church at Avenue South. They're both incredibly healthy, they're both really well led, and their membership is very intentional, and they love the Lord. But they express that very differently with specific ministry strategies that really speak to who they are as people and stage of life and their geographic area as well. My prayer for the future of this church, as well as any church, is that it will not be about the organization. I think it's fantastic that we're recognizing the faithfulness of the last 50 years from the Lord. But 50 years from now, what I hope is that if they're doing another one of these videos, that they're talking about how what we did today laid the groundwork for whatever church looks like then. Okay? There will still be believers, assuming the Lord tarries. There will still be the opportunity for them to gather and learn and grow and love one another. But I hope we don't get so concerned with exactly how that looks and exactly how that happens, because frankly, the way we do church now is very different than the way Bill Wilson and those guys did it 50 years ago. Okay, they were having church based on who they were at that time, right, and the culture and all of those things. Okay, it was biblical, as is the way we do church. And so my hope is that we are able to recognize and separate, right, what is the gospel, what is effective, what reaches people versus what is tradition, what is religion, right? I hope that what we see is the living, breathing expression of God and what He's doing in His church in that time. I hope we respond to that.